Hi, Eric.
Hi, Bob. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Erik Braun. You are a professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Religious Studies. And you have written this book that we're going to talk about today called The Birth of Insight. I'm going to show up the Kindle version, which is the version I've got, but people get a pretty clear idea of what the cover looks like. I gather it's just out in paperback.
That's right.
The subtitle, part of which I'm going to ask you to help me to pronounce, is Meditation, Modern Buddhism, and the Burmese Monk
Ledi Sayadaw.
Ledi Sayadaw.
Uh-huh.
So almost like the word lady, and then Sayadaw has no rough equivalent in English, but it's Ledi. Then the second word is Sayadaw, but I take it that's a title, right?
That's right. It literally means royal teacher, but it comes to be, and it still is now in Myanmar, used to be known as Burma, it comes to mean a revered and august monk, somebody who's a really accomplished monk.
Okay. Well, it's a really interesting and illuminating book, and one reason I found it so interesting is because, the growth of what is sometimes called Western Buddhism in the United States and Europe has led to, I think, some misconceptions about what Buddhism is in Asia. And this book helps dispel some of them, but it also helps explain how some of the differences between Western Buddhism and what you could call Asian Buddhism arose, although, of course, neither is monolithic, but, for the sake of saving time, we'll use these terms. And interestingly, it turns out that some of the Westernization began actually before it came west, began in Asia. And that's, in a way, what your book is about. Is that fair to say?
That is, yeah. Definitely some of the key facets or aspects of what we consider, intrinsic to Western Buddhism really begin in Burma. Yeah.
And it's wrapped up in the interesting story of this very influential monk. We'll just call him Ledi for short.
Sure.
And there are a lot of interesting things about his story. This is more than 100 years ago that this unfolds at a really kind of critical time in Burmese history and a kind of unstable time in Burmese history in some ways. And he's a very interesting figure. He's, for one thing, a study in how to be a good evangelist, I guess. And in fact, I was kind of struck by how he was more like what you might think of as a Christian evangelist than we Westerners might think, with our stereotypes about Buddhism, we might think that a Buddhist monk would be, if you know what I mean. I mean, he's a real preacher, and he's, telling people if they don't shape up, they'll spend a lot of time in hell and stuff like that, right?
That's right. Well, I mean, in some senses, this already gets at that matter of the ways in which the West and the so-called West and the so-called East, in this case, British colonial influence in the culture in Burma, were already intertwining, because the new style of preaching that you mentioned that he was involved in, it was called fan down, because it had been in the past the case that they would take their fan, they'd hold it up in front of their face. Obviously, when I just did that, you couldn't see what I was doing, and that was the point, because it was meant to take away that kind of sense of performance, which would be egotistical, which would be, wrapped up in the person instead of the message. But they put it down, and then they talked directly to the audience. They made eye contact, and it was clearly, in many ways, it had some roots and it made sense in the culture already, but it was clearly inspired and stoked, so to speak, by Christian missionaries who had come and, of course, were engaged in that
So previously, the tradition was kind of literally self-effacing, I guess, almost. I mean, they would hold this fan in front of them and that's, of course, consistent with the Buddhist idea that the self, to put it mildly, is not to be aggrandized. But anyway, he was part of this trend where preachers would be a little more, monks in preaching would be a little more kind of out there and in your face, at least to the extent that you could see their face, which is...
And in fact, they would be really out there. So I think I mentioned in the book and in a few other writings I've done, some monks would take stage names. So in an article I wrote for a magazine, I mentioned that they would take the name of a popular actor, another person, and give it to themselves, but call themselves the monk and then say the name of the actor as a way of like highlighting their own performative abilities. So I say in this article, it would be like somebody saying, I'm the monk George Clooney, or I'm the monk Brad Pitt. And in that way, people would be like, ooh, well, let's go see what this guy has.
Or I'm
to
the
offer.
monk Richard Gere, perhaps more appropriately.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so it not only was the fact that they put their fans down and they give themselves these unusual names, that was a bit extreme, and Ledi never did anything like that. But they would also change their message. So it had been one in which this often surprises people, but it was not unusual for a sermon to be almost completely unintelligible to a normal person, because the point was not to understand it. The point was to experience the whole recitation of it as a way of making good karma, what they call merit, punya. But now it changed to know the message really matters. So let's be sensible, let's speak in simple language. And Ledi was quite famous for this because he was one of the first monks to really make that happen on a large scale, to speak simply, directly, and intelligibly.
Okay. So let's start at the beginning and kind of establish where we are in Burmese history. Before we do that, I do want to do a little bit of a plot spoiler and say that one of the things this explains is how meditation became like a mass kind of grassroots thing. I mean, Westerners think that it just is in Asia. A lot of Westerners, if you ask them what is a Buddhist, they say, well, somebody who meditates. Well, actually, in Asia, almost no Buddhists meditate. I mean, the average lay Buddhist does not meditate. Some monks are more likely to, but even some monks don't. But what this is partly the story of is how it came to be the case that meditation was a lay activity, a widespread activity that went well beyond monks, right?
Yeah, and I would put a finer point maybe even on that and say that now as then, even by far most monks and nuns do not meditate. And right. In fact, even in Ledi's time, it was considered kind of pointless among many because the world was considered so corrupt and degenerate. There was no point in meditating. The best you could do was hold on, get some good karma, and be reborn in a time where meditation would work. So it was a radical shift to begin to meditate, particularly at a mass level. And as you say, that's the main thrust of the book, is to explain how that came about.
Okay. And this idea that they're living in a precarious world, in a kind of a downward spiral, it brings us to the historical point that we're at the beginning, which is that Britain has basically conquered Burma, right? In contest, it's part of a contest with France and so on. But in any event, Burma is no longer self-governing. The king is not what the king once was, and that feeds into this sense of instability. But that in turn has a kind of a Buddhist interpretation, right? Because Buddhism, at least this kind of Buddhism, I don't know how different it is in Mahayana Buddhism, but in Theravada Buddhism, which is what we're talking about here, the cosmology involves these cycles where Buddhism waxes and wanes and eventually will disappear from the world, I guess, to ultimately reappear, right? But is that right? But right now they think they are in a period of decline, and Buddhism may be in the process of completely disappearing.
That's right. I mean, there are some differences between, as you know, forms of Theravada Buddhism, the Buddhism of South and Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and then peninsular Southeast Asia with Burma and Cambodia and Thailand and whatnot. But in this sense, almost all Buddhists would agree that the world goes through cycles and eventually Buddhism utterly disappears. It's not the case that the way the world is that's described by the Buddha stops being the case, because it's always the way it is. The Buddha describes it perfectly according to Buddhists. But people's knowledge of that fact completely disappears until eventually some guy, and he has to be a guy for many forms of Buddhism, though that will vary a little bit, but for Theravadins it generally has to be a guy, will come back and become a Buddha again, preach it again, it'll hang around for a while. The classic amount of time is 5,000 years, and then it's gone again. And it's gone for like incalculable eons. I often tell my students it's like 50 Big Bangs plus a couple of 100,000 incalculable eons. It's a really long time, and then it comes back. So these people in Burma, when the British take over, they fully took over in 1885, and the king he's totally 86. He's exiled to the western coast of India, where he eventually dies, and kingship ends at that time and has never come back. Well, this fulfilled the idea they already had that the world was truly falling apart, that the center wasn't holding, and in that kind of context, there was a sort of opportunity created to take drastic measures, like eventually create mass meditation.
And although I guess the expectation was that Buddhism might be inexorably disappearing, there was an attempt to fight against the tide and
That's
preserve
true.
Buddhism even in the face of Western occupation, and that's a lot of what inspired our hero here, right?
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when in terms of disappearance of Buddhism, but you can stave it off if you act morally, if you do the right things. And so it's like a rearguard action in a sense. They're trying to at least delay and hopefully for a long time the inevitable. And that's the point of the steps that are taken.
Okay. And part of the idea of how you safeguard Buddhism, I mean, it had been the case that the crown, the king, played a big role in the preservation of Buddhism and in the ongoing kind of maintenance of Buddhism. There was, as there often is, a kind of church-state relationship, a symbiosis, but that protector is now gone, and I guess the idea is we need to give Buddhism a firmer hold in the minds of ordinary Burmese people, right?
Right. And I mean, it delighted me at a certain point when I was making my way through all the archival material in Ledi's work to discover that he actually correlated directly to that very point of the absence of the king and what lay people ought to do in light of that. And what he essentially said was that not just lay people, but in fact monks and nuns as well, we all have to be our kings now because the king is gone. So we all collectively take responsibility. As the king used to do singularly, now we do collectively. We, by acting morally, by studying the text, and now he added, by everybody meditating, we can sort of buttress Buddhism so that it does last for at least as long as possible.
Okay. Now, maybe before we proceed, we should step back and talk about, a little more precisely, about the connection between this tradition of Buddhism and kind of Buddhism in America, right? So
Okay.
I think it's, if you had to generalize about kind of Buddhist centers in America, you might say there's three main traditions. I mean, if you walk into a meditation center or a retreat center in America, you're probably in one of three traditions. There's Zen, which hit kind of
Right.
West Coast America in particularly kind of in the 60s, maybe late 50s. There's Tibetan, which
Right.
is particularly prominent now because of the Dalai Lama, I guess. And then, and here it gets a little complicated, I think, because I think what you would say is, and then there is Vipassana or insight meditation. On the other hand, in America, that has come to have such a close association with mindfulness, what's called mindfulness meditation, that a lot of people who go to a Vipassana center, if you ask them what kind of meditation they're doing, they might well say, well, that was mindfulness meditation, right?
That's right. That's right.
And that's, I don't know if we want to get into this, how deep in the weeds we want to get into this, but an interesting question is, how close is the inherent relationship between insight meditation and mindfulness? Well, first, maybe what we should do is talk about what insight meditation is. I mean, again, this is the translation of the Pali word vipassana. Is the general translation is insight, and it's supposed to give you, the goal is to give you insight in a very literal sense, right? An experiential understanding of essential Buddhist ideas, mainly, I gather, the so-called three marks of existence.
That's right. That's a good way to put it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you want to tell us what the three marks of existence are?
Sure. So the idea would be with insight that you do gain insight in a in a directly transformative way into the fact that the world is utterly impermanent, anicca, in the Pali language of Theravada Buddhism, that a world that is utterly impermanent is a world that is inherently suffering. There's a lot of complicated philosophical connections between why it is that impermanence equals suffering, but such is the case for Theravada Buddhists, and they say your insight is gained into this. So impermanent, suffering, that's the second mark. And the third mark is, if all is impermanent and if all is suffering, it's also inherently, well, what you might say selfless or inessential or not, or let's say non-essential. In other words, there's no inherent essence or identity to anything.
Okay.
And so everything is inherently without any sort of intrinsic being. It's all causally conditioned.
Okay.
You can see how these three marks work upon one another.
So maybe we should, that's a lot. So maybe we should kind of review. So impermanence, or I guess the word is anicca in Pali. That's pretty straightforward. People get that. And as you said, there's a lot of senses in which it might lead to suffering. But one of them is, of course, we get pleasure from things, and then the pleasure evaporates, and then we want more. That's certainly a common way that impermanence. Also, people you love will die, and so on. But there's a lot of ways impermanence gives rise to suffering. Suffering is a translation of the word dukkha. It's not the only translation, but dukkha is the Buddhist term. So that's the second mark of existence is suffering. Yeah, all is everything features impermanence. Everything features suffering. The third is tricky because the literal word is not self, anatta, and I don't know again how deeply into the weeds we want to get into this, but it does on the one hand refer to human beings. There is no self in there,
right?
And we could get into that or not as you choose, but also it does apply to things as you perceive them out there. So like if you see a tree and you have this sense of essence, like, oh, I feel this essence of tree when I see a tree, that's mistaken,
right?
Because a tree doesn't have a self either. It gets complicated, and here there is a little bit of a divergence between Theravada and Mahayana in at least what the terminology is to describe all this. But anything else you want to say about?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, when it comes to people, or it comes to trees, or it comes to cars, or it comes to anything, and one of the classic examples that's used to describe anatta or not self is a chariot. So I often use the example of a car with my students, and it's meant to apply literally to cars or chariots, and also to people by extension. Where would you find it? You break it apart. Is it the wheels? Is it the steering column? Is it the battery? Is it the engine? Is it one part of the engine? Is a car that isn't working still a car? The point being that you can never find one thing that is car. And in the same way, so Buddhist texts would argue, or the Buddha, as it's understood by Buddhists, you're never going to find that person there in any one thing, just as you're never going to find a tree or anything else. It's a combination that's come together, and there's a convention that allows us to apply a label to it. They're not denying the reality of people or trees or cars or anything else. It's just the reality of it as an essential thing that has any intrinsic being to itself. And the idea is that once you understand that it's an impermanent conglomeration of parts, you're freed from where fundamentally the suffering comes from. The suffering isn't so much directly the ignorance that there isn't any essential thing there. Your suffering comes from the fact that ignorance that leads you to believe that there is something real there causes you to mistakenly crave, to hold on to it. And of course, craving, what's called tanha or trishna, which literally means thirst, that's where the suffering actually comes from. So there's a way in which it's your craving. Something used to be called desire, but craving is just the term used now. The suffering stems ultimately, whatever form it is, from that, because you are ignorant about the way the world really is, that it is really truly impermanent. And one last thing about that, that's the big thing about Buddhism. They often say these points that they're making, often people will be like, yeah, I get it. I'm not going to find some essential car out there in my driveway. But Buddhism says, but you don't really get it. You say that, but you don't really believe it, particularly about yourself and other people.
Right.
You really do think there's something there, and that's where this really deep-seated holding on happens that insight meditation is meant to expunge.
Right. And here we get to this feature of Buddhist doctrine, which is there are two ways to apprehend the ideas. There's the intellectual way, which is considered important, but then there's the experiential way of actually feeling. And this is where, it takes a lot of meditation to get to a point where you actually feel that there is no self in you, or feel that, and in Mahayana, this is called the doctrine of emptiness, that the tree out there is empty of essence. Now, one thing, and of course the nature of the clinging is a little different in the two cases. So in the case of not self as applied to me, myself, the idea is that pain you feel kind of doesn't have to be part of you in some sense. It's not,
Right.
that is not you. And that's kind of different from looking at a donut and thinking, well, if you understood that that isn't a donut, you wouldn't crave the donut or something, which there I have a little, they're both hard to attain experientially, but even intellectually, I have more trouble with the second one. You can call it whatever you want, but I want it.
Right.
Anyway, does that,
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a strong connection between you and the donut, I think, in Buddhism, for sure, because in some sense, I think a lot of Buddhist thinkers would say, well, you can call it, people will often say, but maybe they're thinking this at a deep-seated level and don't even acknowledge it to themselves. You can call it whatever you want, but I want it. I've had students talk about this with me and say, you can tell me I'm a collection of parts, but I like it. Mm-hmm. I like the collection of parts. And so there is some way in which there's a kind of very demanding sort of transformation, because it's not just a letting go of a kind of an ignorant view to see things correctly and then just be transformed, but a real letting go of certain kinds of kind of needs we feel we have, or kind of wants that we have, that are really quite seriously acknowledged by the Buddhist tradition to be legitimate and not always a bad idea. Mm-hmm. I've often heard it say you don't want to give up your sense of self until you've got a very healthy one. Mm-hmm. If you rush into it, it can be a quite unhealthy thing, and not even truly liberative. So there's a kind of complicated the journey that goes on in this kind of insight process to where you're ultimately able to let go of things in a way that is actually transformative.
Right. And I should say that I don't want to overly mock the idea that really believing the donut lacks a self or essence would make it less attractive, because, in the experiential apprehension of, emptiness out there, or kind of not self out there, whatever you want to call it, that is said to be correlated with a subdued kind of affective reaction to the thing. So part of the perception, I think the idea, I think when you look at human psychology, part of our perception of a donut is the attraction in a certain sense. And so the feeling, the positive feeling toward the donut is so intertwined with our conception of the identity of the donut that if you had a weakened sense of the donut's identity, you would have a weakened attraction to it. I think that's kind of the logic of it. But
right. It is said that generally, though, what you're truly craving is craving. So I think, which is sort of the point you're making, that ultimately what you want, right, is like you want the donut. It offers. That's what I meant by how it's truly a difficult process to give it up, because you're giving up a certain kind of intrinsic way you are, not just the thing out there, because you're like, oh, it's really just flour and sugar, and it's really not anything inherent or intrinsic. Mm-hmm. But you're having to give up some kind of aspect of yourself that does that want.
Well, right. Well, that again, though, that's the part I get more readily in a certain sense, is that I understand that if the yearning I feel inside me I do not identify with, right, there goes the yearning. That I get. So I understand how the not self as applied to me might make me should make me a less grasping person.
Right.
But then and I think people in general have this problem of kind of seeing what exactly the analogy is between not self as applied to me and my conception of myself, and then not self as applied to everything I'm perceiving out there. It's a subtle thing.
Yeah, and it made me think, because you are getting at a very nuanced point, but there is an idea that it's said that if you reach, so this is, I won't get into this in real detail because this really gets in the weeds, but there's actually much technical psychological description of the stages you go through as you really move towards a very significant level of liberative realization and insight. And there is a certain point when it's said that you just feel disgust for the world. They say you're like a lion who only feels free in the 10,000 league expanse of the Himalayas. You just sort of need your space cognitively as well as perhaps maybe physically. And there is an idea, it's said, that you come to be able to see things so accurately at a perceptual level that you just see things constantly passing away immediately. And that really is said to be a sense in which you look at things and you see like a donut or whatever, not just people, but physical objects, and you just see how flimsy they are, that you're truly like, why would I ever invest myself in that?
Right.
So there's a way that even when you understand the not self of yourself, you really come to realize it as intrinsically bound up with your kind of contingent relationship with all these physical objects that are also passing away. So that ultimately, to understand the not self of the self is going to demand you comprehend your relationship to other things that you see as passing away as well.
Right.
I don't know if that's some bridge to how you would link physical objects passing away to yourself, but there is certainly a sense that those objects can give you a very powerful lesson in themselves.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then to get back to the intellectual conceptualization of these things as opposed to the experiential apprehension,
right.
There's one more thing we can say about the two. I think not self as applied to me and as applied to things out there, which I think your original wording was kind of implied, which is that in Buddhism there's a real awareness of, you might just say causality, of the pervasiveness of influence, right? Of like, I am always my behavior is always being influenced by input, by things I see, by things I hear, and a tree also is always interacting with its environment.
Right.
And if you so in that sense, there isn't in either case quite the autonomy that you might, or the self-sufficiency of identity that you might think. So just an understanding of the pervasiveness of kind of interaction between so-called things and their environments is common to the idea of not self as it applies to me, and not self or not essence as it applies to other things. Okay.
Yeah, that's quite true. Actually, I often tell the students there's a story about Suzuki Roshi, who's founded the San Francisco Zen Center, that he was asked by one of his students, I think it was in the 60s, to tell them what Buddhism was in one sentence. And his response after a pause was, everything changes. And that fundamentally gets at the idea that everything is what's called paticca samuppada, or in Pali, dependent origination. Everything is in a causal matrix, so it's all kind of bound up with one another. That's quite true. There's no autonomy whatsoever.
So anyway, insight meditation gives you an experiential apprehension of all this. Especially in America, I think mindfulness meditation is the fundamental tool used in the name of insight meditation. Mindfulness, very loosely speaking, well, as it's perceived in America at least, referring to kind of the, well, I don't know, how what would you say mindfulness has come to mean in America?
Well, I think fundamentally there's one man who's really put it on the map in a certain way, and who's still very active and going strong, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is the creator of mindfulness-based stress reduction at the University of Massachusetts, medical school in Worcester, and he derived it from Burmese traditions that link directly to the book, so it connects to that. But he fundamentally presents the notion of mindfulness as, at its most basic, was what's called bare attention. It's the idea that you look without judging and without elaborating on it, and you accept it without reaction or resistance. Not because you just accept it like it's a good thing necessarily, because fundamentally his idea when he originated this was to help people deal with pain and unpleasant experience, but you accept it because it's there. So mindfulness is seen as a kind of non-elaborative, non-judgmental acceptance of the present moment. That is actually pretty significantly different from how it's understood often in Buddhist context. There's a lot of overlap, but there are significant differences. But that, I think, has come to characterize how mindfulness is often presented when people learn it, particularly in a secular setting in the U.S.
Okay. And if you go beyond Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's a really secular version of meditation, represents a really secular version, and look at famous meditation centers like Insight Meditation Society, Spirit Rock, which were really major entry points for Vipassana into America.
Absolutely.
They are very directly connected to the star of your book. There is a connection to the star of your book in the sense that if you look at, say, Joseph Goldstein, one of the founders of the Insight Meditation Society, which was really kind of the first big beachhead, I would say, of Vipassana meditation in the United States. and you look at like who some of his teachers were, you can I think you can actually trace them back to Ledi, can you not? I mean, in other words, a student of Ledi's teaches another student who teaches another student who teaches Joseph Goldstein.
That's right. And others besides. So, classically, there was also a woman named Jacqueline Schwartz, but Sharon Salzberg, Joseph Goldstein, and Jack Kornfield were sort of at the center of the development of insight meditation. And then Jack Kornfield eventually goes to the West Coast and founds Spirit Rock, but it's in many ways, it shares some very strong continuities, and they still have a close collaboration. But they not only studied with a teacher who directly is in lineage to Ledi, but they also studied with another teacher named Munindra, who was deeply, deeply shaped by the kind of situation Ledi created, but is sort of a kind of very close first cousin to the lineage that directly goes from Ledi. In fact, and Munindra would end up, he is now, he's died, and he lived his last years at a center that was in direct lineage to Ledi. So they're all mixed up with one another. But you can definitely see a clear through line from Ledi to teachers who eventually end up shaping the viewpoint of Salzberg and Goldstein, and Goldstein for sure, and Kornfield and these folks. And I should say you're quite right that when you ask what mindfulness is, and you want to look at a more closely connected to Buddhist traditions sort of formulation of it, this notion of bare attention, and that very term was actually created by a monk who studied within the Burmese traditions, although he was a Sri Lankan lineage monk, he studied in Burma. And there, I think it still holds that mindfulness is this kind of non-elaborative, non-judgmental kind of acceptance of the present moment. But you're quite right that in complex ways, depending on the teacher, there can be more of a kind of Buddhist influence on what they present as mindfulness. But it's curious that even with them, it comes to be something that's quite easy to detach. Not that they want to necessarily, but it becomes something that can kind of sit separate from these Buddhist traditions because of the way it's formulated in therapeutic psychological terms.
Right. I mean, especially with Jon Kabat-Zinn, and certainly even in these
study with Goldstein, I should say.
What's that?
Kabat-Zinn studied with Goldstein and Kornfield, and directly credits them, in fact, with with some of his methods.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And so, and there's two separations that have kind of taken place. First of all, there's been the very conscious separation of meditation from the supernatural context, right? Mm-hmm. These meditation centers that we've talked to, they don't get into reincarnation, much less the various different kinds of afterlives there are, or praying to Buddhist deities or anything else. But also there is a lessened emphasis on, kind of conceptual study, textual study.
That's true.
And both of these things kind of distinguish them from Ledi, right? Which brings us back to his story, because I gather he emphasized the meditation. That wasn't his first big emphasis, right? His first big emphasis was taking the study of Buddhist doctrine to the grassroots, right?
That's right. And so my argument is that the way in which he made mass meditation, both he set the ground for it, kind of increased the kind of likelihood of it, made it sort of appealing in a kind of doable, feasible way, was, I don't think he necessarily had this mission all along, like it was his grand scheme, but by initially, as you say, promoting quite heavily, and throughout his life, he never stopped, study, very complicated philosophical or doctrinal study, let's say, of the Buddhist texts. This is what really kind of prepared people to then employ this study in meditative practice. So for him, it's study is tremendously important to why he was popular, to his appeal to lay people, and to how he formulated what meditation would be.
Mm-hmm. And he put particular emphasis on a body of text known as the Abhidhamma, which is one of, I guess, in Theravadan Buddhism, one of three big collections of texts, and it's the most kind of systematic and philosophical in a way, and a lot of emphasis on the nature of human psychology. And
yes, that's quite true. I mean, systematic doesn't even begin. Actually,
right? It's incredibly elaborate.
Algorithms. It's like computer manuals.
Yeah.
It's incredibly technical, and that's what actually makes it so remarkable that he would popularize. And it wasn't the only thing he popularized. He actually popularized many different forms of doctrinal study. But the fact that he would take this part and really make it something that would generate interest he was reacting to interest that was already there, but it is pretty amazing because even when I was studying in Burma back in 2005, I've been there since, but this is when I was doing a lot of the heavy research for the book. Burmese people would be like, "Ooh, Abhidhamma, wow,
Right.
that's tough stuff," But people were interested in it because they saw it, and even now this is true. They saw it as a source of a tremendous power because it was so systematized.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like you were getting the pure, unfiltered,
Right.
essence of what.
So it's like there's 89 kinds of consciousness. I think that's the actual number, right? There's like
That's
89 kinds of consciousness. 12 of them are unwholesome. And then these different states of consciousness are in terms rooted in different other philosophical concepts like delusion and greed. And
it's tremendous, yeah, and it becomes like a kind of exponentially complicated system as these various lists, of 24 conditional relations, 89 types of consciousness, what have you, begin to kind of interact with one another, and it creates these incredibly complicated permutations of what happens in the mind and in physical reality and everywhere else. So, fundamentally, the world there's nirvana, unlike as you were referencing earlier,
which is nirvana, as most people have heard the term. Right?
Yes, that's quite right. Yeah, so nirvana in Sanskrit, nibbana in Pali, is a real thing in the Theravada conception. It's not. It's its own intrinsic, essentially real thing. It's not separate from the everyday world. It's one real thing, and then there's consciousness, and then there's mental factors, and then there's physicality. These are four. There's only one in Nibbana. There's just one Nibbana, and there's just one consciousness. But the other two, mental factors and physicality, contain a number of things within them. They're categories. But there's 28 physical things. There's 52 mental factors. I'll leave it at that in terms of like the details. But what you can see is that those become combined with one another, and then they begin to explore how they interact. And suddenly you have this system that generates this tremendously complex kind of vision of the world. In psychological terms, as you know, but it's understood to be a system that comprehensively covers every possible aspect of existence, physical and mental.
Yeah, and there's come to be, I think in the West especially, the idea that Buddhism, maybe more than some Western religions, is compatible with science. Right. And, of course, that involves, first of all, not thinking about all the supernatural stuff, but is it the case that you can trace some of the roots of this to what's going on in your book? I mean, they are interacting with the West. These Burmese monks, including Ledi, are interacting with the West. They're trying to preserve the respectability of their own religious tradition in the face of Western culture.
That's right.
And so do you see them kind of starting to highlight how scientific some of these ideas are?
Oh, yes, absolutely, unquestionably. Ledi himself and many other Burmese people at the time, and since then, certainly, as you say, I mean, people continue to talk about this in the West, too. This is a simplification, but you could say that there was two kind of sources of, it probably wouldn't be too strong a word to say humiliation and great defensiveness. And one was the takeover of the British, who, of course, claimed the right to take over because of Kipling's reference, which we now discredit, but was a very powerful idea for them of the white man's burden. And it was the idea, we should rule because you're not ready to rule yourself. Never mind that you've been ruling yourself for ages before we took over, but, we do it better. This is, of course, a great source of consternation and resistance from colonized people. And so they were reacting to that. And often the claim from the colonial figures would be, we're more scientific, we're more technologically advanced, we're just generally more advanced than you are. At the same time, there's missionaries coming in. And this actually runs counter to how people often perceive it now, where often Buddhism seems to have a leg up in this regard. And we'll say Christianity, they usually just direct their attention to Christianity. They'll say, oh, it's not scientific and we are. But the missionary argument back then in the 19th century was Christianity is so scientific and Buddhism isn't scientific at all. And so what we can see a long heritage of is basically Buddhism reacting to that and claiming its superiority. And you see Ledi saying, oh, hey, look, our kind of system of Abhidhamma, say, it's so much more sophisticated in terms of its understanding of the world, in terms of, they would talk about ideas like electromagnetic forces and all these things that they would say that the Abhidhamma presaged. There's even a figure who was a teacher of Ledi's who looked at an Italian anatomy textbook, I talk about this in the book, and said, oh, look at how this anatomist is talking about the structure of the eye, you can see this already in the Abhidhamma. So there's all these ways in which they, from very early on in the kind of interaction of the West and Burma and other countries, Buddhist countries and cultures as well, there was this sense of the need to argue for a kind of scientific, well, at first maybe a scientific parity, but eventually a kind of scientific superiority for Buddhism. That's actually there quite early on, in fact.
Okay, and all of this is, I mean, part of what's going on here, it seems to me, is the kind of enlistment of Buddhism in cultivating a kind of a national pride.
Yes,
I mean, this is with the king gone, the religion becomes in a certain way a more prominent source of national identity, and Ledi seems to kind of set out to kind of bring the two together to strengthen the sense of Burmese identity, a Burmese identity that's grounded in Buddhism. And kind of interestingly, you emphasize the role of printing technology, which I guess kind of what was then modern printing technology had come along with the British, I guess, to some extent. Is that?
Pretty much entirely. There have been efforts prior to the British, but they had not been very successful. It was really with the British that the printing press takes off. So it's true. They're kind of coterminal with one another.
And so he publishes these books. They go far and wide. He goes around and preaches. And it's interesting that the printing press has been implicated in the consolidation of nationalism in the West, which had happened, a couple centuries earlier, I guess. But the ability to get, the same text in the same language all the way around the country very easily, in this case, does seem to have kind of, I guess, consolidated their identity. And he's, I guess, a very effective preacher. And he starts like little study associations, right? And again, a lot of this is about mastering doctrine, getting lay people to master doctrine. And he creates a whole network of organizations, right?
He does. And they're sort of ad hoc as he went from place to place. So beyond that appealing style and very easy to understand style, just like his writing, which is famous for being easy to understand, which had not been true before then. As he would go around, he also traveled a great deal as he was preaching and, of course, writing these books. And it's like he would go from village to village and say he's in somewhere that's like the equivalent of Poughkeepsie. And then he's like, some people come to the talk, and he's like, hey, you guys, now form yourself into a group and study this text I wrote on this topic. And, there could be multiple texts and multiple groups at the same time in the same village. At the same time, I should add, he's also invested in encouraging moral renovation. So he's also encouraging abstention from meat eating, from alcohol, from gambling, from opium. And in many ways, it's a total package. People feel like they're suddenly invested with this sense of knowledge of the Dharma, or Dhamma in Pali, that they never had. They're feeling like they're being morally kind of armored through this kind of new effort to engage in kind of, new kinds of moral practices. They're now being encouraged to meditate eventually. And there's this way in which, as you say, this all creates a kind of subject who can be a source of kind of nationalist pride and kind of self-awareness. It's curious, and it's very complicated, and scholars have talked about it. He's simultaneously invoking Buddhism, which of course is translocal in many ways, but at the same time kind of investing people in the idea of themselves as Burmese subjects with this particular pride. And it becomes the case that meditation becomes an explicit program of the Burmese government on nationalistic terms, and there's a tremendous amount even today, and there certainly has been since at least the 1950s, of when Burma became independent after 1948, of a kind of nationalist pride in their particular skill at meditation, and Abhidhamma, I should add, actually. So it certainly has been the case. It was quite a successful program.
Okay. Now, among the, I guess, other things that, and again, there is this kind of direct connection to what happens here and the spread of a certain strand of Buddhism to the United States in the 70s and beyond. And among the kind of things I noticed in the book about Ledi's brand of Buddhism and things I've seen kind of here, one is that you can carry a meditative attitude into everyday life, or anything can be the occasion for meditation. And it's funny because I've always been kind of suspicious of that. I've always thought, it's like, because some people go, you say, do you meditate? And they go, well, yeah, kind of. Like when I'm in the checkout line, and I'm like, no, I'm sorry, that's not meditation. But it turns out, that he encouraged a certain version of that attitude, right? That everyday life can be meditation.
They did, and I have a quote, in the book, which I think, you probably are thinking of, that where he says, like, oh, it can spring up anywhere in your village. You step out and you see impermanence, and so he did set the stage in a way for the possibility of kind of incorporating mindfulness, let's say, or like for him, it wouldn't have been thought of in quite that way, but like insight could be possible in any given moment. That is something that has a long history in Buddhist thought, but it wasn't understood to be like, that wouldn't have been, and it wasn't for Ledi either. That really wasn't the arena of meditation proper. It was where it could pay off. And I think that's the difference. Because for him, you'll find places where he says, oh, lay people, they don't have to meditate like a monk. Just meditate 3 hours a day. 3 hours a day is a lot of meditation. He definitely held to a high bar in what he envisioned, at least ideally, even a layperson would be doing. Sometimes he would say 2 hours. It wasn't all one thing. He wasn't quite so set, but and he wasn't nearly so standardized as people have gotten now. Now, it can be quite cookie cutter in terms of how people are taught, but for him, it was much more flexible. But there was an idea that meditation was in many ways separate from everyday life, but now it began to blur and bleed into everyday life in ways that could eventually lead to, as you say, 1 minute meditation. And you can put Buddhify or one of those Headspace, one of those apps on and listen on the bus as you're riding along, or there's all these different ways. And
I gather it involved for him conscious reflection. I mean, it gets back to the idea of insight meditation, conscious reflection on what lesson is being illustrated here. Like you're thinking about the impermanence of every little thing as the winds, the leaves rustle, and okay, the leaf is not where it was a second ago, and right. I mean, there is some of that.
There is, and that is one of the interesting things about him, is because there tends to be this kind of how we want to say, a spectrum, where one begins with, and you'll find this in other teachers too, and including many who follow from him. There's an explicit injunction to really explicit study at a really ratiocinative, cognitive, intellectual level. It's understood to kind of shape the mind to the degree that eventually you see that leaf rustle, and it's no longer, I remember the teaching about how all things are impermanent and nothing is staying in the same place. And I even remember the Abhidhamma teaching, and this is an Abhidhamma teaching, that there's atomic structures that are causing things to arise and pass away. But now I've been knowing that for so long, and I've been developing my mind that when I see that leaf rustle, it just transforms me in a way that is beyond cognitive thought. Because even for Ledi, and it's a classic kind of part of Buddhist thought, meditation eventually creates a situation in which the transformation is something that certainly does go beyond discursive thought.
Right. It's almost a perceptual attitude.
A kind of almost like a profoundly ontological transformation in a way, because you're getting rid of bad karma and all this sort of stuff that happens, but it's begun through that deliberative kind of awareness.
So, but he did expect lay people to do actual sitting meditation for a considerable amount of time every day by our standards.
Yes. I mean, that's what he ideally wanted. He was more than aware. He's a very sophisticated guy and clearly knew humans in Burmese particularly very well, that people were going to do all sorts of things. But he has a line or a comment I include in the book where he says, like, oh, these people say I'll meditate in some other life, and they don't realize that, like, a hard work now for a couple decades is a lot better than 100,000 years in hell. He hadn't given up any of that traditional cosmological stuff. In fact, he's not the only one. They would very explicitly argue that cosmological kind of viewpoint with heavens and hells, none of which are permanent, because of course you die from all of them, that was very scientific to them as well.
And was very much invoked as an incentive, as part of the incentive structure.
Absolutely. Bad rebirths is a traditional and profoundly important, from then till now, motivation for practice and study and everything else.
Now, I gather he also, and this is something there's kind of disagreement on this in American Buddhism, I guess I'd say, but I gather he emphasizes the idea that, true enlightenment, really passing the threshold into true enlightenment, which I guess is tantamount to nirvana, is more accessible than you might think. Is he saying even a layperson can have true awakening?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Unquestionably. And that's true. That was something really quite unusual to argue, that or pretty radical to say like, look, this is available to you right now. And I make a point that he actually uses that expression, in this very life.
Right.
And he says like, you can do it. And that was an unusual thing to say.
And that's become kind of a catchphrase. I mean,
right.
In this very life, I mean, so happens, I just saw this on my bookshelf. It says, in this very life. It's the title of a book by...
U Pandita?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these are actually, I think, lectures that he gave at Insight Meditation Society.
That's right.
This idea that you can have it now, to some extent, that did spread to the West, and had been a novel idea.
I mean, I wouldn't. Well, I mean, wouldn't you agree? I mean, I've certainly always thought that was a very felicitous kind of coming together, because already in the West, there was a real interest in the interest in meditation was certainly not to like for an investment in the future, but a kind of immediate result. It has to do with the affirmation of daily life in the West, subjective turn, the idea that the most valuable life is this life you have now, that, kind of non-hierarchical life, there aren't people superior to you. And when that meets this idea that you can get awakened right now from the Buddhist perspective, well, it's a very happy kind of synergy, one might say. And they certainly they ran with it for sure in the West when they heard that.
Although, I mean, actually, there are differences of emphasis here, and at Insight Meditation Society, they do say liberation is the goal, right. But it's kind of frowned upon for anybody to say they're actually enlightened, and they get criticized from this by these so-called hardcore Buddhists, right. who think that because they do kind of, at IMS and places like that, they kind of avoid explicit encouragement, by and large, I would say, of trying to actually attain enlightenment anytime soon. So that's become a kind of a complicated issue, I think.
I wonder, I had a conversation, the book I'm working on now is exploring the links now, it's exploring the history of the contemporary development of insight meditation in the U.S., and its links to Burma. And I interviewed Joseph Goldstein for that once. Hopefully we'll chat again, but what struck me in talking with him was how much more, not in every way, but in many ways traditionally Buddhist he was than I had quite initially conceived, because of the way I was putting him in this kind of transformative framework of the West. And I agree with you. I mean, it's a very traditional thing, in fact, that you do not talk about what you achieve, because in some ways to claim awakening is not to have it, which is true of like most forms of Buddhism. But I think there is a sense in which they don't want to give people kind of they don't want to demoralize people by claiming it ought to be the goal from the get-go. And people often, I've heard it said by many teachers, that they strive too hard anyway. But I wonder if there isn't a strong sense, at least implicitly, that is the place ideally you might go. It's not necessary, but if you could get there, it would be great. In that sense, that there still is a sense in which full awakening would be a wonderful thing for somebody to achieve. But it's true, they don't necessarily celebrate it in the same way. And I'm not aware of anyone in the West making a claim about a Western teacher being awakened in a way that like in the Theravada scene where everyone's whispering about it and the person, isn't speaking about it, but it's sort of acknowledging that. Yeah. It doesn't seem to happen in quite the same
way. I've actually had a couple of people on this site who say that they're awakened. In some cases, it turns out they're defining the term a little more liberally than you might have expected. But
well, I know those people you were talking about, like Daniel Ingram.
Ingram has been on, yeah.
And Shinzen Young and these folks.
Yeah, he didn't say that, but he was on. Kenneth Folk.
Oh, sure, yeah. These kind of pragmatic Dharma people are part of the Dharma overground movement. They're an unusual bunch in many ways. They're probably part of something indicative that's reappeared in Buddhist history too. But in terms of mainstream Buddhist thought, it's clear that they diverge in how willing they are to be. It's true to claims to awakening and all this kind of stuff. They're fascinating for sure.
Yeah, and I can confidently say that all of them have a much higher level of meditative attainment than I do, even though I've tried. So there's another difference between, well, I don't know about Shenzhen so much, but certainly I think between Kenneth Folk and the star of your story, given at least if I'm correctly remembering my conversation with Kenneth, which is, and this again points to something that I think has been to some extent lost as Buddhism has moved to America, perhaps in varying degrees, in varying traditions, and in varying meditation centers and so on. But it's the connection to ethical guidance, not just in the sense of don't harm things, but I mean, in Buddhist texts, there's a very strict ethical regimen. And there, at IMS, there are allusions to this and so on. But I found it interesting that a lot of what Ledi spends his time doing in your book is insisting on people striving for a rigorously virtuous life that will lead to a more favorable afterlife than they might have otherwise gotten, right?
Right. That's true. I mean, folks have pointed this out, and it's an important point that the morality in many ways, particularly early on in the history of, if we're talking about insight meditation, leaving the other Buddhist traditions that arrived in America aside for the moment, like there was a tremendous downplaying of the necessity of morality. Not in the sense I think that anybody was truly like, just, well, there are those people who claimed it wasn't even necessary, but that most people weren't doing that. But there was a real downplaying of it in some senses in favor of just kind of practice. But I see it kind of coming back, but even now it's true that if you sign up for a retreat at many different retreat centers, but I suppose this would apply to IMS, you are asked to follow certain basic ethical principles that are there the whole
during
time.
The retreat. Yeah,
during
intoxicants and no sex and so on.
That's right. But that's pretty much it, and you probably won't get a lot of discussion. I guess it would depend on the retreat, but usually if it's just a straight up insight retreat, it isn't necessarily going to be something that's like that's at the center of what they're talking about. But, I often think about the fact that there's an anthropologist named Michael Carithers who went to Sri Lanka, and he interviewed these forest monks who were famous for their meditation. This was quite a while ago in the 1970s, I believe. And he asked them, well, I mean, all they did was meditate, right, basically. It's tremendously important to their lives. He's like, well, if you had to give up, what's more important? Not so much give up, but he asked them, what's more important, meditation or morality? And he fully expected them to say, well, ultimately meditation is what's more important. And they were absolutely scandalized by the notion that anyone would think that it wasn't morality that was at the heart of what this was all about. Because ultimately that's what the Buddha is, a morally perfect being. The meditation was just a means to an end. Right. And so it is interesting. I would note, just as an interesting historical point, that book you held up by U Pandita, those were talks he gave at IMS in the 1980s. And I was told by another teacher that marked a real, and by a number of actually IMS teachers, that marked a real watershed. And when he came and gave those talks, it kind of injected this new, not orthodoxy exactly, but this new renewed kind of revitalized sense of the Theravada tradition and its possibilities. And I think since then you've seen not a really overt and like heavy-handed, but more of a sense of a kind of awareness and appreciation for the tradition, including morality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I certainly, I want to emphasize that, IMS, Insight Meditation Society, where I've done what retreats I've done, there is definitely a strong ethical sense being conveyed in the Dharma talks and so on.
Yeah.
It's just that it's not kind of specifically and is rigidly tied to the Buddhist text. I don't recall hearing like a sermon on right speech, for example.
Right.
Even though, which is a very demanding precept, right? That you would never engage in malicious gossip, never say anything mean about anybody. That's really hard.
You have to shut down the internet.
Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? It would shut down life. And so that's what I mean is that there isn't but there is a very strong sense that the idea here is to become a better person, to become more generous and kinder, more selfless. And the final thing I'd say about that is there is also this idea that even without a lot of highly specific ethical guidance, meditation can tend to make you more selfless, less self-absorbed, and so on. And not guaranteed to, but it can happen.
Right. I think it's important to note too that when people sometimes have said, "Oh, they're not doing Buddhism or they're doing Buddhism light because they leave out the morality and it's so important." And what's often struck me though is that even if as you say, I mean, they're not putting some explicit doctrinal proposition like right speech or right livelihood or whatever front and center. That doesn't mean that it's any less rich or complex, their
Right.
moral vision of what's involved in this. And I think they often quite successfully, I've only been there when I taught 2 or 3 times, but my sense is that it's often the case that it's presented in a way that certainly includes the notion of a kind of the transformation of the whole self, let's say.
Right.
So, it's just as moral as, in many ways as any other kind of vision. It's just perhaps left implicit a lot of the time
Right.
and not explicitly addressed, let's say.
Right, and I guess that's the skepticism I've sometimes had about people who say they actually have attained enlightenment or it's like readily doable, but they don't see it as having inherently a moral dimension. You're free to define enlightenment that way, but it does seem to me that that's not true to the Buddhist conception of enlightenment, right?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's very clear stipulations about in what ways. I mean, you'll essentially be free of all greed and all hatred and all delusion. That's a classic definition of what awakening is. And yeah, I don't I don't know. I've heard that too, but now I can't think of an example where I heard the person explain like what the transformation meant then. But yeah, there's no doubt about it in Buddhism that it's a moral transformation that happens.
Okay, well, this has been, I've really enjoyed this. I guess I would be remiss in not closing by asking you whether you meditate or have meditated.
Oh yeah, I've meditated a lot, and I'm a very poor meditator in the sense that it's always a struggle. I make no claims to.
You're not enlightened. You're going to shock us and tell us.
No,
you're not
I'm happy
enlightened?
to definitively state I'm not awakened. That's for sure.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I'm asked every semester basically, and I often teach classes specifically on meditation, like how much I meditate and what. But I find it to be tremendously valuable. But for me, it's been more of a kind of almost a practice of this doesn't contradict any Buddhist teaching actually, but a process of self-knowing and kind of self-maturation rather than a process of explicit kind of transformation in terms of what awakening is understood to be in the Buddhist tradition. Mm-hmm. But stay tuned. Contact me in a week. Maybe I'll tell you something different.
You look pretty young. You've got time to become enlightened. Do you meditate every day?
Well, I try,
yeah.
And it's fits and starts, but a lot of the time, yes.
And true to your academic work, do you meditate in the Vipassana tradition? Or?
Yes, because the main reason being that it's what I know the most about. Yeah. It's the teachers I get to talk to the most. I certainly talk to other ones as well, but Theravada is really where it's at in terms of my work and what I do. So yeah, for sure, that's what informs my meditation.
And this being America, is your Vipassana practice very closely tied into mindfulness meditation
it's interesting because although I just said, and it's quite true, that I'm interested in, I don't know that I set out to do this in contradistinction to anything else, but for me it's been about self-knowing and self-maturation. That may reflect because my meditation has been at a fairly basic level. But that said, what interests me most is often the more traditional forms of practice, or let's say the practice framed in more traditional ways by somebody like, though I'm not necessarily a follower explicitly of him, somebody like Nonzero Bhikkhu, or Ledi Sayadaw, or Mahasi Sayadaw, or many of these monks who frame it in a more traditional way, because I just often find that it resonates more richly for me in terms of philosophy and ethics, and just the kind of complex vision it incorporates. Versus the more stripped down kind of versions, which can feel, I'm not making any value judgments, but to me can often feel like they're not offering as kind of rich a vision of what's possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But in any event, Ledi himself did not see as close an association between mindfulness as meditation. Mindfulness meditation was not as central a tool in the service of Vipassana as it has come to be in America, I guess.
That's an interesting question. I mean, part of the problem with that is that mindfulness as a word has been pulled out and almost kind of created as something separate. Ledi would have absolutely considered sati, that term that is now translated as mindfulness, as intrinsic to what was necessary to successful insight meditation. But I think it's a fascinating question. He would have had complex reactions to the idea of that particular term which is really one of a constellation that are necessary as the factors of awakening. For it to have been pulled out the way it has been and almost reified, probably, I think he would have had much he would have sympathetic to about how it's then presented, because it's come to be it's expanded to now include a lot of what would have been left out by just using that term in Ledi's context.
Yeah, although part of that transformation happened in Burma not long after he preached, right? I mean, Mahasi, whom you mentioned, and who was probably in one way or another, according to you, influenced by Ledi, a Burmese monk whose conceptualization of mindfulness very much influenced the version that came to the West, right?
Yes, though I think if you look at what Mahasi has to say about what meditation is, what comes to be termed mindfulness, it's like a Venn diagram. There is much overlap, but Mahasi too, who taught at IMS, he went to IMS. Did he really? Yeah. Oh yeah. Huh. In the when was he there? The late 70s, I believe. He may have even come through twice when he was on a trip to America, but he wouldn't have presented it in the kind of way that detaches it in the way that makes it so accessible to like kind of secular appropriation. He does not, in his writings, even that, you can read now, present it in that way. I think actually in many ways, he too would be somewhat taken aback, though in many ways, like Ledi, sympathetic to what's happened to it, but would not, let's put it this way, wouldn't have characterized his meditation as mindfulness, as just that term, because that, I think in some ways would have been a kind of simplification from the way he does present it. Okay.
Well, maybe we should leave it there. I have lots of questions, but we're getting into more and more arcane things, and that's probably a sign that we should take it offline at this point. But as I said, really interesting book, The Birth of Insight, about a really formative phase in Buddhist history that has implications to this day for the way Buddhism is encountered in meditation centers in America.
Well, thanks. I really enjoyed it. It was fun talking.
Yeah, same here. So take care and good luck with your next book, and maybe we'll do this again.
All right, good deal. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, bye-bye.